In the last episode, we followed the rise of the writing industry straight through to the present day. But for this episode and the next several episodes, I want to take a nice step back. Way back, actually. Because we didn't go straight from cuneiform to text messages to computers. There were thousands of steps between, millions of steps in between. And today, we're going to talk about one of my favorites, one that has fascinated the world over for centuries. So much so that its modern name literally means sacred engraved letters. I'm talking, of course, about Egyptian hieroglyphs, a system of writing characterized by its elegant, picturesque script, and so complex and so different that it was literally unable to be read for millennia. And only now, through the help of a certain stone, can we read it at all. Welcome to the history of writing. While there are some instances of single hieroglyphs elsewhere, including pottery vessels from around 3100 BCE or so, the earliest full hieroglyphic sentences date back to the 28th century BCE, an era known as Old Egyptian. This was in the tomb of Seth Peribsem, and for the record, those Egyptian hieroglyphic sentences read, "Sealing of everything of Umbus. He of Umbus has joined the two lands for his son, the dual king Peribsen." This could possibly indicate that Seth ruled both the upper and lower regions of Egypt, but his name has been stricken from the list of kings put together in later dynasties, so we're not entirely sure. You know, that's the fun of history. We haven't discovered, and I don't know if we ever will discover, if it's even there, a direct line from cuneiform to the hieroglyphs. Again, at least not yet. It's possible that cuneiform influenced hieroglyphs, even if it was just the Egyptians sort of learning the benefits of a formal writing system. But it's also equally possible that hieroglyphs just were made up on their own. There are some examples of what could be proto-hieroglyphic symbol systems that date back to around 4000 BC. So that theory isn't entirely without merit. Now, the largest body of literature found from this old Egyptian pyramid is referred to as the pyramid texts, which were carved on the walls and sarcophagi of, no, not the Great Pyramids, but the Saqqara pyramids. These were meant only for the pharaoh. Nobody else was ever supposed to see these. And they're basically for, protecting the pharaoh's remains, reanimating his body after death, helping him ascend to the heavens. We, of course, know that because archaeologists do what archaeologists do, and they don't care that these were only meant for the pharaohs. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I've never quite made up my mind on that. Aren't they kind of pretty much grave robbers? I mean, we probably wouldn't know as much as we do now without them, but it's one of those slippery slopes. Now, Middle Egyptian is probably what you think of when you think of hieroglyphs. It's not all that different from Old Egyptian, but it's also not a direct descendant of it. Instead, it was inspired by the contemporary spoken language at the time. You can look at it as sort of a different dialect, sort of like modern American English compared to, England English. Similar, kind of derived from the same base spoken language, but very different in writing styles. There were three parts to Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs: logograms, representing words, phonograms, representing sounds, and determinatives, which, because the Egyptian language didn't have written vowels, were at the end of a word to help clarify its meaning. Because of this, there are over 1,000 hieroglyphs in use, possibly well over 6,000 hieroglyphs at one point, which can kind of give you an indication of why it took us so long to be able to read them. Speaking of, hieroglyphs were read vertically, horizontally, from right to left, or from left to right. It's not like English, where English is written in one direction, and that's the direction you read it in. No, hieroglyphs could go any single which way. Which direction you read it in depended on the way the carvings were facing. For instance, if they faced left, they would have been read from left to right. Seems a little complicated. And it was. It totally was complicated. Again, which goes back to the fact that we could not read it for so long. But simplifying the language into a writing form that every Egyptian knew also resulted in some simpler forms being used. Those two forms being hieratic and demotic. That is, priestly and popular, respectively. Hieratic was basically a cursive form of hieroglyphs that was much faster to write. But demotic was an abbreviated form that didn't really look like hieroglyphs at all, which of course meant it was even faster to write. Both of these simpler forms were far more suited for use on paper, well, papyrus at the time, and sort of evolved alongside the more formalized hieroglyphs that we know and love. And they continue to be used. I mean, it's not like hieroglyphs went away when demotic and hieratic appeared. They continued to be used with very little evolution, I might add, even after the fall of the kings and under both the Persian and Alexander the Great's rule. But as time went on and other forms took favor and other religions and alphabets crept into the Egyptian world, fewer and fewer people could read and write hieroglyphs. Even at this time, some, particularly Greco-Roman conquerors, they were already starting to consider hieroglyphs to be this almost magical, almost mystical sort of writing. They would see it up on these walls and these great stone slabs carved in there so intricately, and they were just baffled and mystified. Again, hence the name hieroglyphs, sacred writings, sacred engraved writings. And unfortunately, hieroglyphs ceased altogether around 391 AD, when all non-Christian temples in the country were officially closed by Roman Emperor Theodosius I. So if hieroglyphs stopped being used some 17 centuries ago, how is it that we can read them now? I don't mean we. I can't read them. They're really complicated, and I'm not about to hit up a language program to figure these out. I'm using my English, and that's pretty much all I'm going to use. But some people can read them, some people can know them, and, it's a thing now. You can read hieroglyphs. You can go on the computer and write out your name in hieroglyphs. It's pretty cool. But as was the case with cuneiform, which we talked about a couple videos ago, scholars tried again and again and again to decipher hieroglyphs, to translate them into a modern language. Sometimes almost correctly, sometimes not so much. Piero Valeriano's Hieroglyphics, or commentaries on the sacred letters of the Egyptians, originally written with a title that I'm not even going to try to mispronounce, and originally published in 1556, is pretty much considered to be the first modern-day study of hieroglyphics. It helped that it was the most concise dictionary of symbols published during that day, and was also released in the wake of rediscovering some of Apollo's, that's a combination of Horus and Apollo, in case you were wondering. Yeah, it's kind of a neat name, but not one that you find running around nowadays. Hieroglyphica, which explains some 189 Egyptian hieroglyphs and was published years back. Apollo was likely one of the last leaders of Egyptian priesthood at a school in Meneuthis, around 480 AD or so. So his books, that is Hieroglyphica, was split into two different volumes, may have been the last based on someone who could actually read and write hieroglyphs in a contemporary time. So they're extremely important, and basing your text on it gives it a sense of credibility. But this wasn't a full translation. No, we just kind of, it was basically a dictionary saying, hey, this is this symbol. It was like a picture book. But long after Apollo and Valeriano, between about 1636 and 1654, Athanasius Kircher, a well-renowned scholar of the time, published a series of studies, including his Lingua Aegyptiata Restituta, and even some translations of hieroglyphs. But wait, I thought we couldn't read hieroglyphs yet. I thought that wasn't until later. Haha, we couldn't. Kircher couldn't. He thought he could, but he could not. And we have, now that we can read it, we know that he was extremely wrong. So there's a good example on the Wikipedia page for Kircher. as pointed out by Egyptologist Sir E.A. Wallace Budge. The hieroglyphs we now know say, Osiris says, were translated by Kircher. I can almost not stifle my laughter here because this is, like, you look at the hieroglyphs, it just says, Osiris says, and this is what Kircher thought it meant. The treachery of Typhon ends at the throne of Isis. The moisture of nature is guarded by the vigilance of Anubis. Osiris says, it was pretty off, but it's funny. We had these hieroglyphs lying around, nobody could read them, and this guy was the foremost expert at the time, and people took this and said, yeah, cool, that's what this means. No, he's completely wrong. Absolutely, it's just funny. But the thing was, people kept assuming, wrongly, that they had found the key to translating hieroglyphs. But they hadn't. At least not yet. Because that didn't happen until 1799, when we found the Rosetta Stone. I've mentioned before how much I love the Rosetta Stone. I think it's one of the coolest artifacts of history. But the history, the story of the Rosetta Stone might be even cooler than the stone itself, which is dark gray, about 3.5 feet high or so, 2.5 feet wide, about a foot thick, and weighs about 1,700 pounds. So it's a big stone, but it's only a fragment of the original piece, nothing else of which has ever been recovered. It was carved around 196 BCE to include, and this is the important part, and this is why the Rosetta Stone is so important, the same message, included the same message in 3 different languages. Hieroglyphs, the language of the gods, Demotic, the language of documents, and Greek, the language of the Greeks. They wanted to ensure pretty much everyone around, everyone that would see this monument could read it. Because it was, for the time, an important message. They wanted to make sure it was passed around, that everybody understood exactly what it said. That message was known as the Decree of Memphis, which basically reestablished the rule of the Ptolemy kings in Egypt. They ruled from about 305 BCE to 30 BCE-ish. And given there are instructions within the inscription that the decree should be copied and displayed in every temple everywhere, there were likely dozens, if not hundreds, of copies of the Rosetta Stone's same exact message, carved on stone and displayed in temples around the country. Again, funny enough, we only have ever found the one copy, the one version of the Rosetta Stone. Again, it's not even the full thing. Where are the rest of them? Who knows? But this stone probably did not come from a temple in Rosetta, which is now known as Rashid, the town in which, you guessed it, the Rosetta Stone was found. That's because the town and, more importantly, the land simply didn't exist back in 196 BCE. It's possible it was displayed in the nearby Sais, but that's complete conjecture. Wherever it was, the temple that housed it was closed in 391 by Theodosius I anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But the temples weren't just closed. They were used as quarries for new construction. This happened to a number of ancient structures. Now, you can go to Rome and see the Colosseum, which is probably one of the most famous surviving examples of these old structures being used as quarries for newer construction. You can see that most of the more expensive stone has been taken off of the Colosseum, including all the gold as well. So what would eventually be known as the Rosetta Stone was reused and reused and probably reused again until in 1470 it helped enforce the foundations of a certain fortress, Fort Julian, on the bank of the Nile. For those of you who like math, that's about 1100 years that the Rosetta Stone was just bopping around Egypt, filling in stones somewhere, or just laying in a scrap pile while Coptic Christians, Muslims, and Ottomans just ruled the country. It was this originally sacred document, and it turned out to be used in a foundation. I mean, go figure, right? And as far as I'm aware, there are no records anywhere for where it was during those 1100 years. Though, you know, it's a miracle it survived. Remember, there are hundreds of other copies probably, at least dozens, and they're nowhere to be found. They could be in foundations of other buildings. We don't know. But we haven't found any of them. So this is the lone surviving example of this message. But that fort, Fort Julien, was occupied by the French during Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt and Syria between 1798 and 1801. And it was during those years that a certain Lieutenant Pierre-Francois Bouchard happened to spot the Rosetta Stone while Fort Julien was being renovated and expanded. He reported the find, and this 1,700-pound stone was exhumed and taken to Cairo to be examined by Napoleon Bonaparte's team of experts. He brought this whole team of scholars with him to Egypt when he was doing his campaign, because he didn't want to just conquer the land. He wanted to conquer the people. And what way do you conquer the people? By knowing the people, by playing on their beliefs, by learning their culture and adapting it into your own. So he had a whole team of people. He had mathematicians, chemists, mineralogists, zoologists, engineers, illustrators, and art historians, among dozens of others. Napoleon himself actually inspected the Rosetta Stone before heading back to France. This was pretty cool, right? But just because the stone was found by one of Napoleon's men doesn't mean we could automatically read hieroglyphs, or Demotic, or even the Greek of that stone. First, like I said, that stone was a fragment. The Rosetta Stone is a fragment of a larger piece. And the message that is now on there that you can go and take a glance at, they're fragments as well. All three of them. None of them are complete statements. There was also the matter of a war or two that kind of got in the way of translating this stone, and the fact that the stone switched hands. It started out with the French and inevitably ended up in the hands of the British and is still housed in the British Museum today. Though it's worth noting that Egypt has been requesting it to be returned. Good luck with that one, Egypt. Hopefully it'll happen. It was another 20 years after the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and the work of several geniuses, including Thomas Young, who was the first to show that some of the hieroglyphs represented the name Ptolemy, before Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar, completed decipherment of the hieroglyphs. In fact, only in 1822 was he able to declare that Egyptian hieroglyphs were composed of a combination of phonetic and ideographic signs. Actually, I want to read his description real quick, which was accompanied by a number of illustrations and was eventually displayed in the Louvre. I want to read this verbatim. I have it written down. I'm gonna read it here because it's kind of pretty cool. So Champollion said of hieroglyphs, "It is a complex system, writing figurative, symbolic, and phonetic all at once, in the same text, the same phrase, I would almost say in the same word." Yeah, hieroglyphs were complicated, and I don't think I could put it any better myself than his words there. It's such a complex system, and only through the work of men like that, a whole group of them. It wasn't just those two. It was many people involved in the translations, several highly respected scholars who went at it and worked rigorously to translate it. They're the only reason that hieroglyphs are still around, that they're still so popular that we study them in school. They're part of history now, and they're still just as fascinating as ever. Except, we can read them now. Well, someone can read them now. Not me. I should just go ahead and learn hieroglyphs, shouldn't I? And, learning to read the hieroglyphs, that's the only way that we were able to learn so much about the ancient Egyptian culture. That culture would have been lost if not for the Rosetta Stone, if not for the work of those translators. I've referenced a couple other items, a couple other languages in the other videos where we cannot read them. Those cultures are gone. That's all that's left of them. And that could have been the fate of the Egyptian culture if we weren't able to ever unlock this. Kind of makes you think, right? And hieroglyphs are pretty cool because they're not just this peculiar oddity to look at behind glass in a museum. They're the inspiration, the first edition, if you will, the ancestor of every alphabetic system since, including our very own ABCs. But we will talk more on that next time. The rise of the alphabet. Looking forward to that one. But for now, if you liked this video, please follow Drunk on Riding on YouTube, follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, or head on over to patreon.com/drunkonriding and sign up there for a slew of exclusive videos, Q&As, a whole bunch of other stuff. There's some great goodies on there. I really hope you check it out because the patrons are what make these videos possible. But again, a subscription is excellent and more than enough, as is your review. And thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you learned something. So, until next time, cheers, and keep on riding.